Let's dive into one of the weirdest and frankly most sinister organizations to ever come out of the Third Reich, the Ahnenerbe. Now, try to picture this: an institution that was part university, part occult secret society, and part straight-up criminal enterprise. It was all designed to cook up a new pagan religion for the Nazi state. And this is a story about how pseudoscience became a license to kill.
It's a wild question, right? Could myths actually be weaponized? Well, for Heinrich Himmler and his SS, the answer wasn't just yes, it was a definite and absolutely terrifying yes. They were convinced that if they could just scientifically prove their bizarre racial myths, they could justify any action, no matter how monstrous it was.
You know, to really get the Ahnenerbe, you kind of have to get inside the head of Heinrich Himmler. He wasn't just building a police force. He had this grand vision for his SS as a new kind of pagan aristocracy, a Superiority, he called it, a clan order. But hey, every order of knights needs its own legends, its own mythology. And Himmler was dead set on creating one from the ground up, one that had nothing to do with Christianity, which he absolutely hated, calling it weak and Judaized.
And so, that's how the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society was born. On paper, its mission sounded almost, well, academic. You know, research the history of the Germanic people. But its real job, the one that mattered, was to build an entire intellectual machine to prove the superiority of the so-called Aryan race, using any means necessary.
And just take a look at the team they put together. I mean, wow. You've got Himmler, the head of the entire SS, bringing all the power of the state. Then you've got Richard Walter Darré, the guy behind the whole blood and soil ideology. And then there's Hermann Wirth, a full-blown occultist who is absolutely convinced that human civilization started with some super race living in the Arctic. It was this bizarre cocktail of state power, twisted racial theory, and pure mysticism.
Okay, so with that crew in charge, what did they actually believe? Well, this wasn't just a case of bad history. They were literally making up a new state religion for the SS, and it was all rooted in occultism and what we can only call pseudoscience. The absolute centerpiece of their whole belief system was this myth of Hyperborea, or sometimes called Thule. The co-founder, Hermann Wirth, seriously argued that a superior Aryan civilization once existed in the Arctic, and when their icy continent sank, the survivors supposedly fanned out across the globe, bringing culture and civilization to all the lesser races. Finding proof of this lost homeland, that became the Ahnenerbe's #1 mission.
And if you think that's strange, it gets even crazier. Himmler was a fanatical believer in something called the world ice theory. This theory claimed that everything we know about physics is wrong. It wasn't gravity that ran the universe, it was cosmic ice. History itself was shaped by moons made of ice crashing into the Earth. And the Aryans? Oh, they were the super beings who managed to survive these cosmic ice catastrophes. Meanwhile, actual astrophysics, Einstein's work, was just dismissed as Jewish science in favor of this cosmic fantasy.
Because Himmler himself was so obsessed with these ideas, they weren't fringe at all within the Third Reich. He actively told his researchers to forget mainstream science. This created this weird closed-off bubble where literally any theory, no matter how ridiculous, could be laundered into scientific fact, as long as it fit the Nazi ideology.
So under its next president, a guy named Walther Wüst, the Ahnenerbe just exploded in size. He gave it this more respectable, academic-looking veneer, and it grew to over 50 different departments. I mean, they had institutes for everything, studying ancient runes, musicology, cave science, but also botany and even military research. The goal was to find an Aryan origin for every single field of human knowledge.
Okay, so believing all these bizarre theories is one thing, but proving them? That's a whole different ballgame. To try and find some kind of physical evidence for their claims, the Ahnenerbe launched these incredibly ambitious and expensive expeditions to the farthest corners of the world.
Now, every single one of these expeditions had a hidden agenda. On the surface, sure, it looked like legitimate academic work, studying ancient rock carvings in Sweden or documenting folk magic in Finland. But underneath it all, it was always about ideological warfare and espionage. That trip to the Middle East, for instance, it wasn't really about history. It was about rewriting history as a racial war between the Nordics and the Semites.
But the most famous expedition of them all has to be the 1938 journey to Tibet. So, why Tibet, of all places? Because Himmler was completely, 100% convinced that it was a sanctuary for the original Aryan survivors of Atlantis. No,
Seriously, he truly believed that ancient mystical secrets, including a cosmic energy force he called Vril, were just waiting to be discovered in Tibetan monasteries.
And this is where that search for proof takes a really dark turn. The expedition's anthropologist, a man named Bruno Beger, he wasn't just there to observe. He was there to perform racial classification on living people. He measured the skulls and facial features of hundreds of Tibetan men, women, and children. He even made these grotesque plaster face masks of them. It was all part of this dehumanizing effort to find traces of pure Aryan blood in the local people.
And right here, this is where the story of the Ahnenerbe shifts from being just bizarre to being truly monstrous. This was never a harmless fantasy club for history buffs. This was the intellectual engine that provided the justification for mass murder.
You see, all of this pseudo-academic work, this whole twisted search for a mythical past, it all led to a horrifyingly logical conclusion inside the Nazi worldview. If you can scientifically prove that other groups of people are subhuman, then exterminating them stops being murder. It becomes a biological necessity. And this brings us to the Ahnenerbe's most direct and sickening link to the Holocaust. A professor named August Hirt proposed creating a collection of Jewish skeletons for study, arguing they needed specimens before the race was entirely wiped out. The Ahnenerbe's general manager, Wolfram Sievers, organized the whole thing. 86 people were chosen at Auschwitz, murdered in a gas chamber at Natzweiler-Struthof, and their bodies were shipped to an anatomical institute. This wasn't a byproduct of war. This was science as an act of murder.
The Ahnenerbe also directly funded and supported the deadly medical experiments of a doctor named Sigmund Rascher at the Dachau concentration camp. Under the guise of military scientific research, prisoners were put through absolute hell, horrific high-altitude tests in low-pressure chambers, and freezing experiments in ice water. The results were sent straight to Himmler, all packaged as valuable wartime research, and all of it was sanctioned by the Ahnenerbe.
So after the war finally ended and the full scale of these horrors started to come to light, what happened to these men? The men who committed these crimes in the name of science? What exactly was the legacy of this Institute of Horrors?
Well, the legacy is deeply, deeply disturbing. While a key administrator like Wolfram Sievers was tried at Nuremberg and executed for his crimes, many of the so-called academics got off far easier. The president of the Ahnenerbe, Walter Wüst, and even Bruno Beger, the anthropologist from the Tibet expedition, were eventually denazified and went right back to prestigious university careers in post-war Germany.
And because they were able to return to these positions of academic power, these men were able to control the story. For decades, they actively suppressed any real research into the Ahnenerbe's crimes. They whitewashed it, painting it as a misguided but ultimately harmless project. It took years for the full, monstrous truth to finally emerge.
The story of the Ahnenerbe is more than anything a chilling warning. It shows just how easily the tools of science, research, anthropology, medicine can be twisted into instruments of pure evil when they're stripped of ethics and chained to a monstrous ideology. It leaves us with a question we should always be asking ourselves. When the pursuit of knowledge loses its moral compass, is there really any limits to the horrors it can unleash?